To conclude the retreat with some thoughts about Easter for us to take home with us. And rise, O my soul, in freedom. That's been the watchword of our culture, epitomized, symbolized, characterized by the United States, search for freedom. You know, when we're suffering in bondage, one way or the other, whether by addictions or by some other race, we want our freedom, and we naturally rebel against our bondage, whatever form it may take. You know, I think of the poor Israelites. They had been taken from bondage by Moses, who Yoganandaji said was an avatar, a great soul. And later they were held captive by Nebuchadnezzar and taken off to Babylon, and then Cyrus from Persia took over Nebuchadnezzar and he freed the Israelites to go home. But you know, they had a long history. The Greeks, after what's-his-face, the Great, came in and conquered that land, and then came the Romans, and so you can't really blame the old Israelites for wanting their freedom from that kind of bondage. Unfortunately, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, and not too many of them got the memo, unfortunately. But still, you know, when you're suffering, you can't help but want to suffer. So how do we meet our tests, whatever they are? You know, we think ours are the greatest ever, and that's just how it is. You know, for us, they are the most difficult tests. And in a time of great brutality, and when life was characterized by difficulty, if not suffering, at the time of Jesus, you know, the Romans put down several rebellions in 35 years after Jesus' death. They destroyed Israel and crucified thousands of people, not just there, but throughout their empire. So suffering was a given. That kind of suffering was a given in his time. And so for him to show that he could endure that and forgive them, for they knew not what they did, was an important lesson for such people in that time. For us, most of our suffering tends to be somewhat on an emotional or psychological, mental level, but then we think of the people in Ukraine and what they're going through. So how do we meet our tests? We can't help but want to not have them. You know, when you're in, let's say, severe physical pain, what to mention deep emotional pain, you are in hell. You do think it's never, you can't imagine a state of happiness in that case. But the lesson of the crucifixion, for which the resurrection was the ineluctable consequence, is for us to meet our inevitable tests. You know, Buddha went out and escaped the palace and affirmed and recognized the threefold suffering of humanity: old age, illness, old age, and death. And so that's the way it is. And so what did we learn? What can we learn from the saints and the masters and Jesus Christ? You know, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed that this cup passed. He wasn't excited about what he had to do, you know. And yet even in that very moment, he knew what he had. He always knew what he had to do. It wasn't news. He knew what he would go through. And when you read his words sensitively, his brief years in his work, he was constantly at battle with the forces of hypocrisy, materialism, and so forth. So he knew. And so like us, you know, so much of what we've come out of, especially in the West in Christianity, but not just here, it's the same in India, in the East, but we characterize it differently. Where we define the spiritual path by suffering. That's not really, I mean, that's a given. Everyone suffers, whether you're spiritual or not. So, okay, that's a given, but We don't define our spirituality by the degree of our suffering. Well, the lesson of our trials and tribulations is the degree to which we face what we must face calmly, with faith, and as we go deeper with the, not just the affirmation, but even over time and practice with the deep knowing that whatever comes to us, however unpleasantly wrapped, is divine grace. It's the lesson in the great school of life that teaches us something. I mean, it's not easy to be grateful for pain, but the great saints have done that. Jesus did that. And so the lesson of our tests is the way we are victorious and resurrect our spirit is by facing our tests as a gift, certainly as a lesson, certainly with calmness, and certainly with faith that all is for our own upliftment.